Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the impact of the pandemic on global markets, growth, trade, and food security in Africa, organized by IFPRI with the support of USAID. My name is Fousseni Traoré, and I'm a research fellow in the Market, Trade, and Institution Division of IFPRI, and I will be the moderator of this event. We would like to thank you for joining this virtual event live, and thank you to those of you who are watching this recording after the event. We have an exciting program with 4 parts. First, a couple of opening remarks, then 5 presentations, 2 from IFPRI and 3 presentations from regional actors based in Africa. Then we'll have a Q&A session and some closing remarks from our Director General. We are eager to hear from you. To participate in the Q&A sessions that will follow the presentations, please submit your questions on ifpri.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. So without further ado, let's get started with the opening remarks. And I will now call on Sam Benin, who is IFPRI Deputy Division Director for Africa, for his opening remarks. Sam?
Thank you, Fousseni. Greetings to you all. From where I am, it is good morning. As you know, the novel coronavirus, or COVID-19, has shocked economies and livelihoods in every part of the world. Africa, the focus of the topic for today, is fighting the crisis within several crises, including, for example, the locust outbreak in Eastern Africa and the recent flooding in the Sahel region, as well as continued and widespread conflict. This implies that the already vulnerable populations, the situations of them have become dire. Therefore, assessing the impact of COVID-19 on growth and food security in the context of global markets and African agricultural trade, which is the topic of this virtual event, is very important. And it seems that the policy implications should be relevant to those other shocks as well, and that the efforts and resources devoted to fighting those other crises must not get crowded out. As IFPRI ramps up its research on COVID-19, it remains committed to broader research and policy analysis in support of Africa's development agenda. On the broader topic of African agricultural trade, for example, IFPRI, in partnership with others, recently released the 3rd edition of the Africa Agricultural Trade Monitor, also known as the AATM, at the just ended AGRF, which is the African Green Revolution Forum. As you know, agricultural trade is important for the continent, and African leaders have committed to tripling intra-African trade in agricultural goods and services under the Malabo Declaration on Accelerating Agricultural Transformation for Improved Livelihoods and Shared Prosperity. But let me not bore you with my opening remarks, as I know that the speakers have very exciting research results to share with you. And let me close by appreciating the partners of IFPRI in conducting this research and also in this broader work. I especially thank USAID and the CGAIR research program on policies, institutions, and markets for their support in this work. Please enjoy the presentations. Over to you, Fousseni.
Thank you very much, Sam. So the next speaker is Mr. Patterson Brom from USAID. He is a senior trade advisor at the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. Patterson.
Thank you, Fousseni, and thanks to everyone on the IFPRI team for bringing this webinar forward. We believe it's very important to get this important evidence out, and certainly good morning and good afternoon to everyone else joining us. My name is Patterson Brown. I'm the Senior Trade Advisor in USAID's Bureau for Food Security and Resilience in Washington. And we're very pleased to be a part of the discussion today and be able to showcase some of the great work that IFPRI and all our other partners are doing IFPRI continues to be one of our go-to partners that can bring the evidence and analysis country and regional policymakers need. With the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we turned to IFPRI to help in tracking the impact of COVID-19 on markets and trade flows, supply chains, and on economic and nutritional outcomes. We knew this wasn't something to wait on, based on the experience of the 2007-2008 food price crisis, which very quickly brought to the forefront the need for better evidence, data, and analysis. That period showed us that important trade policy decisions would be happening in real time, and we needed to be able to bring in real-time information to look at the impacts from decisions. That would be covering the short, medium, and long run. So IFPRI, along with our partners here today, have been critical in generating the fodder needed to make better policy decisions. And as you'll hear more about on the webinar from the partners and presenters, COVID-19 is most directly impacting access to food, as well as disruptions to availability and certainly affordability, as well as consumer demand changes toward options toward cheaper, less safe and nutritious foods, and on changes in food prices. So from the USAID perspective, above all, we want countries to have access and use evidence to the best decision-making evidence that can be for the well-being of their people, certainly the most vulnerable, and to accelerate progress on their journey to self-reliance. Trade is a necessary building block in reaching system-level transformation and sustainable growth. Food trade within and between countries allows diversification of supplies that helps reduce vulnerability to market shocks. We simply won't get there without trade, and this is in an opportune moment in time. In particular, we want to support the very ambitious set of commitments that African leaders have taken with the African Free Trade Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Our partners on the webinar today are certainly essential pieces of that broader effort. That agreement has incredible promise in unlocking regional trade flows that will help to increase the affordability of safe and nutritious foods, improve resilience of vulnerable communities, countries, and regional markets to shocks, and above all, in lowering poverty and hunger. We see this webinar, along with two others that will follow this fall, as one of the avenues to bring forward additional evidence and perspectives to help African nations and their partners conclude and implement that agreement. With that, I'd like to say again, thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this event, and I look forward to the presentations and discussions.
Thank you, Patterson. So let's move to the presentations. And as a reminder, to participate in the Q&A session, please submit your questions on ifpri.org or Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. So let's start with David Laborde. David is a senior research fellow and the head of the Trade and Macroeconomics Group in the Markets, Trade and Institution Division of IFPRI. David.
Thanks, Husseini, and thanks everyone to be with us today. I'm going to provide you the kind of big picture about what COVID-19 means for trade, and particularly in the case of Africa. And the other speakers will provide some more focused discussion both on agricultural market and specific value chain. But as Patterson has said before, we also will have other webinars that will look at specific aspects regarding regional integration and informal trade, for instance, and how in the specific situation things have evolved. So next slide, please. I mean that you should all aware that this COVID-19 is a one-in-a-century type of shock that is initially a health crisis that has degenerated in an economic crisis and has also some food implication. And the three main channels at play is, on one hand, this huge economic crisis that creates a disruption in economic activities and is a loss of income for everyone in the world, especially the most vulnerable groups. So if you're a daily worker without social protection, you are on the front line if you cannot go to work every day. You have some supply disruption, including in the access to inputs or in the processings that will basically impact producers, and consumers are impacted also by other type of disruption, some linked to panics or some linked to bad policies like export restriction, as we have seen. And so it really is how people react to the crisis more than the crisis that can be at stake. Next slide, please. So let me maybe just say, okay, if we're interested in trade, it's because it's a way to provide different products that you need and to generate income. So we are not really focusing on trade for the sake of trading, but really about how it can help and improve a livelihood and to understand how it is impacted by the different elements I have raised before. In my presentation, I will not discuss specific questions like logistics, but really I will say about how COVID-19 is really impacting both the economic activity and so this income generation aspect, but also how it changed consumer demand. And of course, we are dealing with a crisis that is evolving every day, so it's very difficult to get, detailed data, especially on big macroeconomic indicators like trade at a high frequency. But we can already see on this graph how the different regions of the world have been impacted in terms of people mobility. So we track people with their cell phone, thanks to Google. And Africa is not one of the most impacted regions, meaning that people have continued to go shopping, to go to work, but less. You see, for example, on the lower right corner, going to workplaces, it has been decreased by 20% in average in sub-Saharan Africa. But other regions like North America or Latin America has been much more significantly impacted. But still, you see, we are talking about important disruption, about how people go to work, how people are shopping, and therefore what type of things they are demanding. Next slide, please. But the other point I would like to make clear is that when we talk about Africa, we are dealing with a very diverse set of countries that have some similarities, but different countries are actually impacted differently. And here is the same type of how people are behaving, and you see differences across the continent, where like in Cameroon, people are relatively not impacted or have recovered normal practices relatively quickly. While at the opposite, countries like Mauritius, and in particular due to the huge disruption of the tourism industry, you have seen this fall in economic activities much more significantly. And you see on my graph that the situation has started to improve in the more recent weeks, but maybe the second wave starts to also manifest, and we are not sure how and we will phase out of this crisis. Next slide, please. So, as I was saying, we are actually facing a major shock, even if Africa is not the most impacted so far by the COVID-19 crisis at the health level, but also in terms of disruption in economic drivers. Africa is one of the most vulnerable regions initially. Why? Because we have a high level of poverty. And so here you see the different economic shock. On the left side, it's the fall in national income. And actually, Africa, in some cases, is much more affected than the rest of the world, but it's particular, like in Central Africa, countries that export oil, and the oil market has been heavily impacted this year, so a lot of loss of income. And on the right-hand side, you see also different projections about depending on what type of recovery we can get, but also this heterogeneity within Africa. So really keep in mind that I'm going to talk about Africa, but Africa doesn't mean a lot. It's different countries that have different things at stake. Next slide, please. So now that you have this macroeconomic impact, here you start to have an idea, as I've said, about why we are trading. So the way to look at it is what we call the current account. On my slide here, you have both on the left part, consolidated current account, so when we add up things for all Africa, and on the right about what is happening if you just make an average across country without weighting them, so thinking that Mauritius and Nigeria will have the same weight. And what do we see? So the left part of these columns are the credits, so your exports. And so what you use to generate income on global markets. And on the right-hand side, what you are using this money for. And the things with Africa is that first, there is a structural deficit. So Africa needs foreign finance to cover it. But basically, Africa is exporting goods, commodities, but also services through tourism, and get money through remittances. So by exporting is labor force. And these three components are actually impacted by the crisis. So the capacity for Africa to pay for its import bill is directly impacted by this. Just also to keep in mind that the gap between the credit and the debit here, so the capacity for Africa to pay for what it imports, is basically covered by both FDI, that will be negatively impacted this year, but mainly still by international development aid. That will be a very important way to deal with that. Because the current crisis is basically impacted both sides, and as we are going to see in some cases, it can impact more the export side than the right side. Next slide, please. On the remittances, so here I'm going for the sake of time to say that, of course, we have, when you factor all of this, you start to see significant impact in terms of poverty and nutrition outcome. We can go back to during the discussion. Next slide, please. But the point I want to make here is on the left-hand side here, you see how remittances have started to be contracted globally. So here the year-to-year increase, but you really see this big contraction. And that's Western Union data, by the way. And on the right-hand side, you see this macroeconomic impact in terms of your effective real exchange rate. So if you start to not have the capacity to pay for your import bill, you are going to start to run a current account deficit, and your real exchange rate, that basically is a good metric about your purchasing power on world market, is decreasing. So your capacity to pay for your import and your import demand is going to shrink. And here on the graph, you see also the heterogeneity across countries with, like if you see the green bar for Nigeria, really the collapse coming from the oil price. Other commodities like copper have been impacted also, so country like Zambia. And Côte d'Ivoire is in an interesting situation because, yes, on one hand, the cocoa price have fallen, but Côte d'Ivoire is part of the CFA franc zone that is pegged to the euro. And with a strong euro, actually, it has protected some West African countries to suffer from this real exchange rate depreciation. So it has maintained some of their purchasing power. So this is where all this complexity of both financial variables and trade variables interact. Next slide, please. So if now I'm just looking about how this crisis in exporting export price and import prices, and we have basically a metric called terms of trade, and that you will see on the left-hand side of my graph. You see this big collapse, especially on the export price. Raw commodities, both agricultural but mainly minerals, have really hurt Africa as a whole significantly. So their capacity to pay for their import bill had been restricted. That's very different from how the economic crisis is translated in East Asia, for instance, that is importing a lot of raw commodity, cotton, oil, and actually mitigate the impact of the economic crisis by getting this gain in purchasing power. But as I've said, think that different countries in Africa are impacted differently. And on the right-hand side, you see this ratio between export price and import price. Blue, it means that it was an improvement. Red, it was a deterioration. And it really depends about what you are producing. So if you are producing coffee that has relatively good price recently, or gold and diamonds that people have bought during the crisis as a safety value, moreover, South Africa went through some disruption on the supply chain, you get a better price. If you are selling other type of goods, like cashew nuts, with the fall of demand of China, price went down. Next slide, please. And that will be my conclusion. First, you have this heterogeneity, but what it will mean in terms of recovery. And what we have seen is that actually, if you just focus now on agricultural terms of trade, before it was a big picture, because, in order to pay for some of your import bill, you may want to export other things. So if you not just focus on agriculture, you see that actually the terms of trade and the export price of agriculture have been pretty resilient. That's very common in this type of macroeconomic crisis, meaning that even in the worst situation, people continue to buy, so the food demand is much more stable than other type of demand. So agriculture can be a way for the recovery, especially if we have a kind of slow macroeconomic recovery overall. On my graph, and that will be my last word that will make the transition with Joe, you see that around April, you see this jump this fall of the terms of trade, and that was typically related to the price story of rice, because rice is one of the big commodities imported by Africa, and directly linked to some policies response in the rest of the world. And I think Joe will talk about it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, David. So the next speaker is Joseph Glober. Joe is a senior research fellow in the Markets, Trade and Institution Division of IFPRI as well. Yo.
Thanks, everyone. Unmute myself. Okay, I hope everyone can hear me now. First of all, go ahead and advance the slide while I talk. I'm going to follow up on what David was talking about. I think what we're going to find generally with a lot of the, certainly the bulk trade, but also other agricultural products, that they have been affected negatively in some cases, but surprisingly very, very resilient. And I think David's point that even during recessions, people still tend to consume food, that we'll see that in some of the measures that we're looking at. This is just looking at transportation costs. I think this has been very, very important for specialty crops in Africa, or exports that are going to Europe that say cut flowers or other things that typically may be using air freight. Those prices have been very high. Why? Because people aren't flying, and because the number of aircraft that are actually flying to and from continents, fell dramatically. That's been a big story this year. Next slide. If you look at general consumption trends, however, you can see that really 2020 is pretty much flat, up a little bit for most of the major commodities. Wheat's down only because feed use in 2020 is projected down from where it was the year before. It actually, for 2021, which that year has already begun, the 2021 year, that wheat consumption is projected to be up again. But cotton is one that really stands out, and that is one that is affected by a global recession. Apparel consumption is projected way down, and because of that, cotton is down. Maize is down a little bit only because of the impacts in the US on ethanol, because of people are driving a lot less. That means a lot less gasoline is being consumed, a lot less ethanol is being blended into gasoline, and a lot less corn is being made into ethanol. Next slide. If we look at the trade picture, and these are just numbers that the WTO has released, you can see for the first quarter, actually, those were pretty good for most regions, including Africa. That if you look at agricultural exports, up around 6%. In the first quarter, but we can see that more recent data, if we're looking at April, those are down. Now, in other areas of the world, like the Pacific, you can see Asia and the Pacific, you can see that the first quarter was down. That was reflecting the fact that they were hit by COVID earlier, and then started to see a recovery a little earlier than the rest of the world. South America will be interesting, I think, if only when we start seeing data for May, June, and later in the year. Next slide, we'll look at imports. And there, it's a very similar story. That is, imports actually have been up for a lot of regions, including Africa, including even with the more recent data. But you can see in Europe, North America, other areas which are, again, important markets for Africa, that those import levels have declined for agricultural products. Next slide. So the one issue that is, when looking at the food price crisis of 2007-8 and 2010-11, one of the big concerns was all of the policies that were put on to things like export bans and other restrictions that cause these big price spikes. And so there's a lot of interest. IFPRI's been tracking policies, as many of you know. We have a portal on our website that can give you up-to-date information on export restrictions. This just shows you kind of the vulnerability to grain export restrictions just by looking at some FAO data on what % of the diet comes from cereals in terms of calories, and how important imports themselves are as a portion of total total cereal consumption. And you can see that not surprising, North Africa is very, very high, and that's essentially a story of wheat. That's important because one of the early countries that announced that they might be did put on export restrictions for a few months were Russia and Ukraine. And there, you can see the sort of vulnerability that some of these countries have. Rice is another important import crop for some regions. And there, we look at countries like Thailand or Vietnam that we're discussing export restrictions. The good news is, next slide, is that actually none of these countries of the major grain producers really maintained restrictions for very long. And I think that it's hard to zoom in on the individual countries here, but the effects were relatively minor. Now, local effects, though, are also very, very important. I think some of those are harder to sort of track on a day-to-day basis. But you take a crop like onions in South Asia, that we have seen restrictions there. They're a very important crop locally. To see those sorts of restrictions, and with cross-border trade being halted or whatever, those are important commodities to track. It's far more difficult to get the sort of day-to-day information on that, but it points to the importance of transparency and trying to reporting on this. Next slide. Well, the last slide here just looks at the commodity prices. And I think there, again, the story is a lot of these commodities, we saw a big price drop in the first quarter, second quarter of the year, but we have started to see recovery. Now, some of that has been aided by what's going on in the grain markets with China importing a lot more wheat, a lot more maize. But generally, there's been a recovery now. So I think that's it for me. Next slide, if there is a next slide. No, there isn't. So I'm going to stop there and yield back my time.
Thank you very much, Joe. And now we'll move to the next series of presentations. We'll hear some special remarks and conclusions and recommendations from the field, from Africa. So the first speaker will be Nalishebo Mebelo. She is a senior program coordinator in the regional network of agricultural policy research and institutes in Zambia. And once again, as a reminder, if you want to participate in the Q&A session, please submit your questions on ifpri.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or on Twitter using hashtag AskIFPRI. Nalishebo.
Thank you, moderator. Let me begin by thanking the two initial speakers from IFPRI and USAID who spoke earlier, and the two presenters who have very clearly and elaborately made presentations on the global perspective of the impact of COVID-19. And also to appreciate IFPRI and USAID for inviting RENAPRI to be part of this webinar today. And as Patterson rightly put it, there are many pieces to this issue of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, and RENAPRI happens to be one of those pieces. I'm based at the Secretariat of RENAPRI, and I coordinate the day-to-day programs of a network of agricultural policy institutes that are based in 10 African countries. And the network generates high quality research to guide national, regional, and continental level agricultural sector policy, We also undertake outreach while also building the capacity of African agricultural policy research institutes to be able to undertake excellent research. So in appreciating the two excellent presentations that were delivered by David and Joe, I will give just 3 broad points. My first point will look at an overview of some of the work that is being done by RENAPRI to guide national governments and other regional and continental institutions concerning policy responses to the impact of COVID-19. And I will try to focus on issues of trade. And then I will share some of the findings. So based on the research that has been undertaken by our centers, what are some of the findings? And how do those findings relate to David and Joe's presentations, and possibly cite an example here and there. And then I will just give some concluding remarks. So in terms of what RENAPRI has been doing in the context of research towards informing policy during the COVID-19 pandemic, each of the 10 RENAPRI centers has been providing some real-time data to their national governments to address the impact and using tools that are suitable to the current context. As you know, doing research during this period is not that easy. The centers have also provided an inventory of the key areas or questions that are relevant to supporting national COVID responses. And to name just a few, our centers have been looking at the status of food, the implication of global trade policies on key commodities such as rice. Rice is a big commodity. Food price outlooks by quarter, agriculture input supplies, tracking of food value chains, impact of COVID-19 on essential foods, its impact on nutrition security and livelihoods, its impact on household purchasing power, impact on intra-African trade, as well as impact on landlocked countries, non-landlocked countries, effects of lockdowns on food production and distribution, effects of restricted movements on supplies of inputs. We have also partnered with non-RENAPRI institutions. For instance, together with IFPRI, who are here tonight, we co-chair a task force on food and nutrition security data and hunger hotspots during the COVID-19 pandemic. You might be aware of that, our IFPRI colleagues who are here. And under this task force, we are about to embark on a review of the policy responses to COVID-19. It's one thing to do research on the impact of COVID-19. It is another to also research the policy responses that have been implemented by our governments. And so this is a study that will be undertaken in partnership with, I think, the University of Washington. RENAPRI also, in partnership with the Alliance for African Partnership and IFDC, are leading on the research work that will lead to the second African Fertilizer Summit. And this is aimed at boosting production and productivity. And production productivity is a key topic during the current era of COVID-19. And we've been involved in various other issues. So in terms of some key findings, and just to relate them to the presentation made by our colleagues David and Joe, it is true, as stated in the presentations, that there are different impacts due to different drivers, and that Africa is not homogeneous in several ways, and that therefore there will be variations in terms of the impact of COVID-19 from country to country. And thankfully, RENAPRI is in several regions of Africa. So we do get feedback from our centers that is sometimes not necessarily homogeneous. So some of the research findings point to the fact that border closures are restricting trade flows of food and related services. COVID-19 has disrupted regional and global trade and slowed demand for Africa's agriculture export products, placing jobs and livelihoods at risk. Food inflation is said to be higher than non-food. There is declining total national imports, and this has been noted in several member countries, including non-landlocked countries, such as our colleagues in Ghana. COVID-19 is transported by humans, And therefore, transporters, cross-border transporters, have been noted to be sometimes carriers of this virus. There are threats of high-level poverty and malnutrition looming in the horizon. And I saw this in one of the presentations. Inflation, currency exchange rates, rising food commodity prices, these are also evident in the findings. Increased transportation costs, that's a given. Low production due to supply side constraints, and these are coupled with the already existing challenges in fertilizer use, low extension services, and these are negatively affecting output, including not only quantity, but quality of food. And this is leading to low availability of food, increased demand for food, and of course, increases in food prices. Reduced incomes due to reduced employment opportunities, all these resonating in David and Joe's presentation. So in just sort of wrapping up my intervention, I just wanted to say that high quality research, good data analytics will continue to play a critical role in guiding our national, regional, and continental level policy in Africa during the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, for the purposes of this topic, research in issues relating to global trade and trade in Africa. It is becoming evident that the current coronavirus is here for a while. And I'm seeing that African countries are beginning to take note of this. It's here for a while. So we need to develop strategies that will ensure that we deal with our economies and ensure that we get some growth happening positively. So I think I would like to stop here, moderator, and wait for questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Nalishebo. Now we'll move to the next speaker, Jane Nalunga. She is the Executive Director of the Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiation Institute based in Uganda. Jane?
Thank you so much, moderator. Thank you so much, moderator, and thank you so much, the previous presenters. And also a big thank you to IFPRI for this very important conversation. My presentation, I'll be adding on to what has been presented. In fact, putting a face on what has been presented. As Yatini, we work on issues of trade, investment, fiscal policies in order to make these policies work for the people. So my presentation will also be tilted towards that angle. I will share experiences from Uganda and from the East African region as regards the impact of the disruptions in domestic, regional, and global agricultural markets, and the impact it has had on growth and food security. As we are aware, the COVID-19 pandemic and the measures containing it, which included border closures, international and domestic travel restrictions, closures of business, they have disrupted agricultural markets at all levels with far-reaching impact on growth, food security, and people's livelihoods, especially in Africa. And as has been pointed out, Africa is more vulnerable because already the pandemic found the continent in a very vulnerable position. And disruptions in trade have affected the agriculture sector because most of our exports are commodity exports. For example, in Uganda, 80% of our total exports are made up of agricultural products. Added to that, more than 60% of African population depend on agriculture for their livelihood. So anything which disrupts agriculture affects the countries and also affects the people. At government level, the disruptions have led to public revenue losses and to limited capacity of government to provide public services, and also to be able to respond adequately to the crisis. This has also led to a high level of indebtedness in many African countries as they look for resources to be able to address the pandemic. And as David and Joe pointed out, all this is happening in against the background of the falling remittances, of the falling FDIs flows, and also on the very negative impacts on key sectors in African economy like tourism and agriculture. There have been mixed impacts in Africa as regarding on agricultural production and food security. To give an example, in Uganda, there has been increased availability of food in domestic markets, especially in urban areas, because we are not exporting anymore. And because also government has food to come into the urban areas. Again, also the urban poor, number of them could afford food because also there was no markets. But because of limited incomes, even the urban poor could not access food. And also the small scale producers could not access the increased inputs because of the increased costs. And this is going to affect the future production of food. So in government put in place measures, one, to distribute food to the urban poor, but the food was purchased from the private sector, from the middlemen. So that small scale producers never benefited from government purchasing of food. Government also put in place the e-voucher system to help small-scale farmers to access inputs. But again, the system of the e-voucher system is in certain districts, but it's also an online system which leaves out so many small-scale producers. I just want to look at some proposals on the way forward in order to address the market disruptions and in order to promote agricultural trade. One, I think it's very, very important to make agricultural markets work for small-scale producers. Africa has a very huge rural population, and agricultural growth will be key to addressing poverty, inequality, and also should be a key factor in the policy COVID economic reforms. So one of the proposals is to address the existing productive capacities. You know, that these have been there for a long time. The whole issue which was raised by in the previous presentation on the Maputo Protocol, it was agreed, African countries agreed that at least 10% of their budgets should go to agriculture. But my country in Uganda, it has never gone beyond 4%. So there are issues, long-standing issues to address agricultural productive capacities in Africa, which we need to address. And COVID has shown that the only way to survive in Africa is to be able to put emphasis on our agricultural production. The second point is that we need to address the challenges in the global, regional, and national agricultural markets. For example, at global level, there are also the long-standing challenges in the WTO negotiations, issues around subsidies, issues around tariff escalation, issues around the cotton issue. All these issues, the agricultural issues, should be revisited in the WTO. At the regional level, I can give examples of border closures because, for example, in the East African region, even before the COVID, border closures due to COVID, there were already trade wars, border closures, and I think these are issues which have to be addressed because regional markets are important to stimulate agricultural production. Last, at the local level, again, we need to look at trade policies which lead to unfair competition on the domestic markets for small producers. Therefore, we need viable markets for domestic producers for them to be able to produce. Lastly, it's also important to discuss issues around the policy environment that will enable increased production and productivity. And these have to be holistic, they have to be interrelated. Policies regarding trade, investment, fiscal, all these issues have to be self-supporting and interrelated. And lastly, there's a lot of debate around post-COVID economic reforms. Agriculture and agricultural production has to be at the center of these debates. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we are going to move to the last presentations by Purvi Patel. She is the Deputy Chief Executive Officer and Head of International Relations, Research and Development at the Export Trading Group Farmers Foundation, EFF. So once again, to participate in the Q&A session that will begin soon, please submit your questions on ifpri.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. Purva?
Thank you, Faseni, and thank you IFPRI and USAID team for inviting me to participate in this exciting seminar. It is indeed the discussions so far have been absolutely in line with some of the observations and experiences we are having. And if we may please move to the second slide. I can begin my introduction of my presentation with a quick background of who we are for those of you who do not know us. So Export Trading Group is a 53-year-old agricultural supply chain company started in Kenya, and we have moved across 5 continents. And over 7,000 employees and 95 processing plants, warehouse, over 462 warehouses. We trade over 7 million metric tons of commodities, and we move them annually. And next slide, please. But we trade 40 commodities, out of which top 10 are food commodities, which comprise of about 80% of those 7,000 metric tons. So we do see the impact on the trade quite substantially. Our Export Trading Group's major vision and mission is to facilitate production of high quality crops and provide a market for all surplus commodities. And I think I just want to highlight that for the purpose of our discussion today. Next slide, please. What I want to highlight by these graphics is to just give you an idea that we have a rural, urban, and port infrastructure that connects our small-scale rural farmer to the global market as well as across the region. I will focus on Africa, and in Africa, we are largely present in Eastern, Southern, and Western Africa, over 20 countries. So this is where we have this level of infrastructure. And so we are able to see the impact starting from the farm gate all the way to the destinations across different continents. Next slide, please. Our in the next, what I want to show you and highlight here is that our trade of millions of metric tons is directly linked with small scale farmers. Over 85% of the commodities we trade, we buy, we sell, they are with small scale farmers, and only smaller percentage come from the commercial. And this is basically exporting African origin commodities, as well as importing what the continent needs, as well as processing. So what we see is farm to fork supply chain and impact across the board. And I just want to highlight some of the observations. Next slide, please. So the point that I'm making, that how Export Trading Group and why am I speaking to you as head of Export Trading Farmers Foundation, is that while we are independent, we are linked with Export Trading Group, and the way we integrate our some of our activities are into boosting sustainable practices and building and strengthening new supply chains, bringing smallholder farmers to formalized either financial systems, into cooperatives, and increasing the production. So in my capacity with my team on the ground, we are very much seeing the impact in the socioeconomic as well as farming sector. Next slide, please. And what I want to just leave the introduction here and just highlight on 2 points, that main function of the foundation would be the supports and creation of sustainable supply chains, and connecting smallholders with the entire supply chain actors. Now, so how does COVID impact relates to our work and our experiences? I would take you through that slide, please. Next slide, if I may. And if we may skip this slide and go directly into the impact, that would be great. Thank you. So ETG, what the conversation so far and the research and as well as the other comments by my African colleagues, we concur with many of those comments. And I just want to highlight that what are the practical experiences that we see as a multinational, and yet, and how do we see the impact of COVID? We still have a lot more optimistic perspective than many other people, and I'm gonna just talk about that for the rest of my presentations. So as every other speaker has indicated, that reduced efficiencies in external stakeholders. And this results from the lockdown, from the government. Yeah, you have people working from home environment, the unstable network situation. And so the whole paperwork that requires even to say export or import anything, those things get delayed. Export Trading Group, we work heavily with WFP and many other food aid programs. So even those international organizational staff has been working in a lower capacity. So all these contractual movement have significantly slowed down, and that also impact the trade. So we see, just highlighting the sesame trade, I would just want to give you an example, that lockdown in various countries, say specifically Sudan, Nigeria, Togo, impacted timely shipments deliveries. So you have either the receiving countries being in lockdown or the exporting countries. So those logistical delays have caused the disruptions and the trade. ETG China, our China operations, it was interesting how it all began in China, and yet by end of March, as we probably all know, that China started to get into full production, but we have ended up with oversupply. because the movement and the demand from the other side of the continents, it hasn't kept up with the supplies. ETG India is still going through severe lockdowns, but our processing plants and movements have never stopped. And what does that mean for a company? And we will see in the next slide. I just want to see that farm to fork supply chain, the way other speakers have pointed out, we see loss of employment has impacted. We see that the fear of uncertain economy. So even if people do have capacity, they are holding on to their purchase of higher ended commodities, fluctuation in local currencies. I mean, being on the continent, we have seen that a lot. Say in Zambia, I'm also sitting in Lusaka, Zambia. We see that kwacha has deteriorated significantly over the last 6 months. So these are some of the highlights of how, when you are working across the continent in rural and urban setting, what level of infrastructural and capacity building investment that becomes an added cost. It is just an operational cost that a company had not quite anticipated. And then with slowing down of the whole supply chain and the business, so it has put an extra burden on the operations and cost. Next slide, please. Our logistical, you will see that you can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So employee sensitization, because it has been a key investment for us, because we also have cashew processing plants, and we have number of food processing plants across the continent. So this requires a significant monitoring and management to be able to function during this kind of extreme conditions. So at ETG, we say that actually our work has increased during lockdown. We actually never have quite gotten into lockdown in the company. On the current market status, so just want to highlight some of these things. What does it result? And this again relates to what David and Joe has observed earlier. So stock feed plants in some countries were as down as 60% between March to July, because even, of course, the demand, some countries had lockdown, and most importantly, the price, I mean, the affordability for an average consumer suddenly disappeared. And so those companies, even our own stock feed plants, have struggled, but now they're picking up. Other impact I want to highlight, which is indirect and yet it is direct, because as we know on African continent, we do have to import a lot of machineries and equipment and spare parts. Not everything is manufactured here. So we depend largely on South Africa, China, India, and all of these countries, we have had challenges. So South Africa has been in lockdown, closest and quickest to get there, but it has slowed down. Now, just recently, we have been getting non-essential items and these kind of emergencies that will help us to bring the processing plant back to running at full operational capacity. So we are getting some permits, but otherwise non-essential items have also impacted the processing capacity. What we've seen in production of soybean, maize, and beans, as far as the production goes, we have not seen they being severely impacted, largely because the season in many parts of the continent had already begun. And we have continued to procure from the farmers and the farm gates. So the procurement hasn't stopped, but what we see is this cash crop, behavior? that small-scale farmers, as the schools shut down, and that is the main reason to buy to sell commodity at the harvest time, because you need to have cash to pay for the school fees. And we see there is a very, very interesting behavior that farmers either, they are holding on to the crop. There is also a fear that what if we sell everything, we may go through food insecurity. We see that slowly this behavior is coming, normalizing as the schools are also opening across many countries. Pulses that Africa is the biggest exporter of pulses to India and Southeast Asia. We see that India is in our supply chain. India had much lower production and the demand was much higher. However, last 2 years, the demand was lower, so farmers had already diversified, but suddenly the pulses price has gone up as high as over $50 to $70 per metric ton, because India is needing more. So that is interesting. Rice supply chain, and I know David alluded to that earlier, but we have seen, I would say, particularly in Tanzania and of course in West Africa as well, but rice value chain has been negatively impacted, and that is from farmer all the way to processor. But we are really hopeful that with Asian imports being down or being curtailed, the farmers and the governments will work together to make sure farmers are able to sell their commodities. And processors, what we see is the processor from Tanzania who are exporting to nearby neighboring countries like DRC, Burundi, Rwanda, to Malawi even, they have been hit, particularly the SMEs. Overall, we see that COMESA and SADC policies on essentials good, prioritizing crucial imports, maize roll moved across the port. Initially, we saw a lot of delays. In fact, earlier in March, our logistics team came up with a fantastic solution when we were stranded between Tanzania and Rwanda to disperse inputs. And that was literally would have affected over 10,000 farmers. And the borders closed. The government were still dealing with what to do with COVID-19 and how do you test the drivers and COVID tests. So we came up with an idea that let's create a relay team. Usually the Tanzanian driver would go across, but here we kept a team of drivers ready at the border and the trucks were taken over by them while the other drivers were waiting for the COVID test results. So I think these are some of the way of tackling from private sector perspective. And my last comment is overall crop production has continued and we remain hopeful for better climatic condition. And we will continue to run our operations and support the farmers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Purva. Now we are going to start our Q&A session. And once again, please your sub-questions on ifpri.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. So the first question will be for David. So you mentioned remittances, tourism, receipts, and less exports of oil and gas as negative factors on Africa. So the question is, what about international aid, as well as major differences between given countries, for instance, Cameroon, according to their geographical areas and livelihoods?
So thanks for the question and the reminder to get unmuted. Yes, as we have seen both in the different presentation, we face different degree of specialization across countries, and also, you know, who is your main trading partner. So far we have seen countries in East Africa that have strong links with India that were less disrupted at the beginning of the year than countries that were more focused on China or with Europe. So that's what we have to keep in mind in terms of, what type of product you are exporting as a country and who are your trading partners. So the bulk of the shock for Africa remains on the minerals sectors. So, even in terms of strategy of diversification, that's always important to keep this in mind. The hyper-specialization in minerals in this current situation is really a doom. When having a more diversified portfolio, including with agriculture and within agriculture, between different cash crops and food product, that's quite important to increase resilience. So yes, meaning all the big oil exporters have been really hurt by the crisis that actually has not started with the COVID-19, but the price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia on the oil market. But the COVID-19 came on top of this. Then, of course, all the country depending on tourism, because when we talk about trade, we think trade in goods, but also trade in services and tourism. And here, yes, countries like Mauritius, Kenya, Tanzania, Senegal have suffered a lot. And how it's going to continue during the year, that's going to be quite important, because if travel restrictions remain, or if just people are just afraid to travel, when you will enter, in some case, in the winter season in Europe, where traditionally you see more people moving south to enjoy their vacation during the winter break, that will be, some major issues. So all this question of timing within the year is quite important. And yes, overall, we have countries that have lost 20–30% of their external revenue already, and will require international assistance in terms of financing their current account, but also in some cases we need to make sure that they can shift to more domestic production if you cannot afford international goods on world markets.
Thank you, David. So the next question will be for Purva and Nalishebo, and I will ask all the speakers to keep their answer short as much as they can. So, has African countries identified main food commodities for export after COVID-19? And how can Africa remove most of the factors militating against agricultural development? Maybe Purva first, and then Nalishebo.
Thank you. I think the food commodities that we have always been exporting, they continue to remain so, which is you're looking largely at sesame, we are looking at cashew nuts, we are looking at pulses, so those are, I will just highlight that those are some of the largest major commodities that are going outside of the continent, and then across regional. So I don't see that it has slowed down, but what the main impact is the economic impact on the buying power. So the raw commodities leaving the continent, if the destination is lockdown countries, then the processes have slowed down, and that impacts the trade and the supply chain. If they are going regionally, if they are being processed, then the buying power has reduced. So it all depends on the commodity. But otherwise, production, as of now, it hasn't been severely affected. So it should not hinder the export. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Nalishebo?
Thank you very much, moderator, for that question. I think Purva has obviously answered that question in full. She's obviously identified the commodities, the large commodities that have to be that are usually exported out of Africa, and that there has not been any impact yet on that. But I said earlier on in my presentation that COVID-19 is going to be here for a while. And so I think we need to remove the narrative, this negative narrative around issues such as trade, that, we are going to be impacted heavily. What our national governments need to start doing now is beginning to realize that the pandemic is here to stay, and we need to ensure that we put in place strategies and begin to open up trade as much as possible. Because if we continue with the negative thoughts around the impact of COVID-19, chances are that we will then begin to see exports of those commodities actually beginning to reduce. So we need to begin to realize that COVID is here, it is here to stay, and let us not continue with that negativity around the possibility of COVID reducing the amount of trade that is happening between intra-African trade as well as global trade.
Thank you. Now a question to Joe from our colleague Antoine Bouet. Export restrictions are very damaging. Can WTO do anything about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Fus. And as you know, what the WTO can do best here, I think, is maintain a transparent system so that countries are aware when these restrictions go into place, how long they're supposedly, if countries can let people know how long they're going to be in place. It unfortunately is fairly powerless to do anything to prevent countries from doing that. I think when the G20 met, for example, back in 2011, when the ag ministers got together and confronted this issue of export grain restrictions, I think what their feeling is, if nothing else, if they could provide better information about markets to countries, that there would be better policies. So, for example, in 2010-11, while wheat prices were going up and other prices were going up, actually there was a lot of supplies on the market and availabilities on stocks, but still countries were implementing export bans. I think that by contrast, when 2012-13 came, AMIS, the Agricultural Market Information System that was created by the G20, actually helped the situation at that point by pointing out that there were ample supplies when the North American drought and the Southern European drought came. But the WTO, I think, has been very active in trying to get members to notify their problems or notify their restrictions. And if you go up on their website, they have a long list of those things. And I think we've been fortunate this time around, just because I think a lot of the actions that we saw initially in March and April turned out to be far less consequential than we thought they would be. Now, again, I think Nalunga and others have talked about the problems, and Purvi talked about the problems, local problems that we're seeing, and I think those do need to be addressed as best possible. But WTO, its best efforts right now are in the transparency part of it and to make any of these restrictions known. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. A question to David and to Jen. So wouldn't import substitution for food products appear to be a good step towards coping with similar crises and increasing local resilience? This is a topic that has been much debated over the last decades, starting in the 60s.
So I think that as a trade economist, you believe in some level of specialization. So meaning that people try to do the type of crops and products and or services that they are good at, and we should not force fit specialization on people. I mean that if you have not the agroecological system or the good labor force and the good skill, because being a farmer and good farmers requires human capital, you are not going to produce your own food efficiently, easily. So trade will lead to specialization. Now, as with any kind of specialization, too much specialization makes you more exposed to risk. So the question is how governments are managing risk. But this year we have seen both the COVID-19 and of course the external constraints mean that for some countries buying food on world markets may have been a bit challenging on the short term, but it's more a liquidity issue, but also the locust crisis in East Africa. And you have this type of crisis that, being self-sufficient if you are hit by locusts will not save you. On the contrary, you need to make sure that regionally, globally, we are pooling risk, we are managing risk, weather risk, pest and disease, global risk. So really it's more, I think, how we define coordination at the regional level, at the continental level, at the global level, than saying, okay, we need to produce individually at the country level our own food. Because some countries will not be able to do it in a sustainable way, environmentally, lack of water. Some other will not be able to do it economically. And therefore, that's what I would just be very careful in terms of saying, okay, we need to produce our own food. Many countries will not be able to do it. The question is more how we manage risk and to have a balanced development strategy, both in terms of crop, commodity, macro risk management, value chain risk management. And that's it. I hope that I provided the key elements.
Thank you, David. Jane, your view on that?
Can I add on?
Yes, please go ahead.
The whole issue of import substitution is about substituting those imports by locally produced products, which is very, very important. And it goes also, it's related to value addition of those products which you have been importing, but you add value to them at the national level. For me, I think value addition is very, very critical because it's the key to agricultural production and productivity. It's also key for stable incomes, not just at household level, but also at national level. Because the biggest challenge facing Africa are the fluctuating prices of our raw products on the global market. So if we can be able to import substitute those products which we are importing from outside. For example, oil, oil, we import oil, yet we can be able to make it from our own sesame. We are eating raw sesame and importing oil. So it's for me, it's a key to agriculture production. But again, it all enables countries to create employment across the value chain, because some of the value chains are very lucrative. So, but what's important is to be able to put in place supportive policies and to be able to plan, because you are not going to import substitute everything. Also the policies, the supportive policies at the regional, national, and global level, and also sectoral policies like trade, investment, even education policies. So it isn't something which can be undertaken without a very protracted planning. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Now we are going to take two more questions for Purva. So the first question is, how does ETG define smallholder farmers or small-scale farmers? And the second one will be, which specific policy changes are needed to bring back the food supply chain to a pre-COVID level in all respects?
Thank you. So how does ETG support, which is, we are, as I said, we have not gone into any lockdown. We have been continuously working through our rural infrastructure with our extension team, through foundation, as well as ETG input teams. And we are supporting farmers with the market. Our processing plants haven't stopped. Our export and working with other food aid organization, we continue to do that so that the food moves across the continent and where it needs to go globally. So that way we are committed to work through the pandemic. And second question, could you please repeat that for me?
To define small-scale farmers?
Define small-scale farmers, you are looking at subsistence farmer who is sitting far away where nobody can get to, all the way to the farmers that are residing near urban areas. So our outreach is literally across the 20 odd countries, we go all the way to the farm gate level. So we are looking at a small scale farmer who is producing the commodities that we do business with. So that farmer is with a 1 acre or 1 hectare and producing either for family and anything that farmer has surplus. So I think I want to highlight that the farmer definition would be that anyone who has surplus to sell above and beyond their food security is the one we do business with, and all the way up to the bigger farmers. And as far as policies are concerned, in relation to COVID-19, I see that we continuously work with the government agencies and the logistical challenges. So as of now, we find that we don't see a significant we don't have significant recommendation for one thing or the other for any policy changes at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. So a question to Nalishebo and to Jane. Are the private sector sources for food imported, and from which countries? EU, US, or other countries?
Sorry, could you repeat your question? Private sector.
So the question is, are the private sector sources for food imported from the EU, the US, or from other countries? Do you have any data related to that?
Private sector sources, sorry,
yes, the
private
sector sources for food imported.
Do we have data for that?
Yes, or do we have some evidence the countries
yes,
the imports are coming from?
Certainly there is evidence. Our centers, as I said in my presentation, have been looking at some of the trends, the import trends, the export trends, and they've obviously been identifying sources of those commodities. I don't have the details with me right now, but certainly our centers are involved in doing that sort of research, identifying sources of food imports, but also countries to where we export products from the countries where we are located.
Okay, I would like you to keep the floor for any final comment you may have in 30 seconds. We'll begin to wrap up after I move to Nalishebo.
That was me who just spoke.
We are going to wrap up, so I would like to give you 30 seconds if you have any final remarks you might have.
Okay, all right. So my final remarks obviously are just to thank IFPRI and USAID for inviting us to be a part of this conversation. And just to share that the RENAPRI Annual Stakeholders Conference will take place on the 18th of November 2020. And during that conference, we will obviously be sharing some of the key findings from the work that I just described in my earlier intervention. Thank you.
Thank you. Jen, also, if you have any final comment and if you want to react to the question on 30 seconds, please go ahead.
My final comment would... Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, we can hear you.
Would be on addressing the issues affecting... Hello? And to say that the pre-COVID situation shouldn't be the yardstick. And I think we should be more ambitious because the pre-COVID situation also had challenges, very, very many challenges. So when we are looking at the future, we need to be more ambitious, building on the lessons we have learned in order to be able to build a resilient agriculture sector in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You are welcome. Purva?
Thank you. We feel that there is plenty of food available globally because the farmers haven't stopped working. They have been in the best position to isolate themselves, and they have continued to work. The issue is the economic downturn, the impact that has led to loss of jobs, less income, the fear of food security or just financial insecurity has substantially impacted the entire supply chains. So the consumer is also impacting hugely. So you see the cheaper food products are being consumed heavily, high-end products, not so. And that is also impacting the tax income for the government. So say beer, so many companies had to shut down or reduce their operations. So the focus should be on how do we focus on boosting agriculture, support the farmers, and that will turn back the economic engine our countries need. Thank you.
Thank you. Joe?
Thanks, Foos. Yeah, I would just echo everyone's thoughts. Thanks a lot for the invitation to be here. I learned a lot. I think the getting this local perspective and regional perspective is very, very important for me. I agree with what was said by Nalishibo. I think COVID's going to be here for a while. I think this is something we're going to have to get used to and figure out how to work around and how to lower the costs of doing business given these new constraints. The only comment I would say, the one thing I'd like to hear more about at some point, and moderator, you're one of the ones who are working in this area, is the role of informal trade in these situations, to see how informal trade has been impacted, if informal trade has increased in some cases because of restrictions, but that's for another seminar, I think. So again, thanks very much.
Exactly, very good point, Joe. David?
Yes, no, thanks everyone for joining in this seminar. What I will say is, I think it has made it clear that, actually farmers have been pretty resilient during the crisis. Everywhere in the world, they have continued to work and people need to continue to eat. So making sure that we use the farm sectors and agricultural trade as a source of resilience is pretty obvious during the crisis and should be a lesson reminded for the future. But I will conclude by this aspect of policy coordination, because a lot of the unfortunate events we have seen, and some have been mitigated, was coming from uncoordinated policy response. When in some countries, even within some regional group in Africa, they have closed the borders, disrupting logistics without coordination with their neighbor, or globally when we are seeing some of export restriction. Unilateral policy response will be the last resort, not the first one, and really providing information, as most of the people in this call are doing, to inform policymakers that they don't act just with their guts, but based on evidence, and finding dialogue with their partners in the next country or in the next continent is so important in time of crisis, and that really should be the big takeaway. Policy coordination based on up-to-date and good information is so critical in times of crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for those remarks. Now we are almost at the end of the webinar, and I would like to welcome our Director General, IFPRI Director General, Johan Swinen, for his closing remarks. Yo.
Thank you very much, Hussaini. Hello, everybody. I think this was a very interesting seminar with a lot of very important contributions. It was also a very rich set of presentations. I have selected this is a purely personal selection. I just picked out 5 points which I thought were important, and there were many more on this. This is just a subsection. Also, not to repeat the things which have been said already. The first one is that obviously markets and trade are crucially important in poverty reduction and growth. And this is true in general, obviously, but it's certainly also true related to the impact that COVID-19 has. And so we're talking here both global trade and intra-Africa trade, both formal and informal trade. So the disruptions to trade and to these markets have been significant and have had large impacts on basically the well-being of many of the poor people. My second point is that the disruptions of the trade and the impacts of the related impacts on poverty and food security and nutrition have been affected by a combination of macroeconomic effects and microeconomic effects. So the macroeconomic effects, where both David and Joe, I think, pointed out quite well, have to do with basically global prices that changed, and impacts both in the real economy and in the financial economy coming together. At the same time, we've seen the breakdown of supply chains, which Purva gave with excellent examples from the real world, her company, which she described in great detail. I think all these things are very powerful to understand. But what is crucial for us, I think, also moving forward, finding the right policy responses, is to understand that the interaction of these micro and macro effects are there, and basically we need to build them in our analysis. Third major point is that we know that the impacts are large, the average impacts are large, but there's huge heterogeneity among the countries. And I think David did a great job of documenting this with macro numbers, but it came back in the presentation of several of the other participants who described this heterogeneity in different ways or with different indicators, okay? It's not only that the heterogeneity is different in terms of the effects, but that also, of course, what is causing this. Dependence on oil in terms of exports or in terms of imports, dependence on tourism, remittances, specific sectors in the country, all these things are important. My fourth point is that it is clear that COVID-specific policies are important, so policies to address the impacts of COVID. But what came back, I think, in several of the presentations, particularly the one by Jane, also was that the traditional policy recommendations remain very important, okay? So it's not that what's happening with COVID suddenly makes that all these other things don't matter anymore. Things like reducing trade distortions, including export restrictions, increasing agricultural productivity, reducing market imperfections, enhancing access to markets for smallholders. All these things have not been, are not less important because of COVID, but are in a way even more important of COVID, and we should not let that out of our sight. And then my final point, my fifth point, has to do with, and this has come back in various ways in all the presentations, the importance of data and information. Okay, so we need good indicators, both in terms of the impact and in terms of the policies that are there, or basically how policies play a role or not playing a role. This allows, and then of course, if you have good data and good information, you should do the right analysis. So quality analysis is important to provide evidence-based policy making as an input to evidence-based policy making, also for larger development strategy, and also a point which came back in the end for feeding into international negotiations, providing more transparencies, I think. So this means for my own institute, for IFPRI, that there's lots of work that remains to be done going forward, but we should emphasize that the role of collaboration in this is really important. Collaboration with national research institutes such as NARPI, as emphasized by Nalunga, and the role for donor stakeholders, different stakeholders, the private sector certainly also plays an important role for us to understand what is going on. Okay, I think those are my main points, which I wanted to emphasize at the end of what I thought was a great event and a very rich set of presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, you, for those points. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this important discussion. Please join us next week, Tuesday, September 22, at 8:30 a.m. EDT for our book launch on Ethiopia's agri-food system, past trends, present challenges, and future scenarios. So special thanks to all the speakers and to our communication team for the logistics. So now I declare this webinar closed. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.